Today we will discuss about the overhead cost. If you remember, in the introduction session itself, we discussed the concept of overhead. What is overhead? Overhead is the sum of indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses. So, overhead is equal to indirect material plus indirect labor plus indirect expense. Fine. Now, we will discuss that how the overhead expenses can be allocated and apportioned among the different departments and different cost centers, right, today. So, what is overhead? We will start with the basic definition. So, overhead may be defined as the cost of indirect material, indirect labor and such other expenses including services as cannot be conveniently charged directly to specific cost centers or cost units. So, indirect, example for example of indirect material, we have, if you remember, we discussed in material cost, it is say lubricant used in machines, right, which you cannot directly allocate to the final product, right, because machine is being used for producing several items, right. Indirect labor, for example, the salary paid to the office staff in the shop floor, right. Usually what happens in a shop floor, there is a small office and there is a office staff, who maintains all the records and everything. So, salary paid to him. So, that we can consider as indirect labor. Similarly, the other expenses, like for example, electricity bill, electricity cost for the street lights within the factory premises. So, these are the examples of overheads, and we will learn that how these costs can be apportioned. What is the meaning of overhead? It should be noted that direct costs are associated with individual jobs or products. If you remember, we give an example of direct material like iron sheets used for vehicles, right, for manufacturing vehicle bodies. So, that is an example of direct material. The worker who is directly working in the assembly line for producing the product is the salary or wages paid to him is the example of direct labor. So, indirect expense or overheads are not associated with individual jobs or products. They represent the cost of the facilities required for carrying on the operations. Like as I said, salary paid to the office staff, electricity cost for street lights within the factory premises. These are the examples of indirect expenses. So, CIMA London has, according to CIMA London, Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, overhead is the expenditure on labor, materials or services which cannot be economically identified with a specific sellable cost unit. Say for example, in case of a Maruti, the sellable cost unit is the car, the passenger car which they produce, right. So, the expenditure which cannot be directly identified. You can identify the cost of metal body, right, which is used for manufacturing the car, but you cannot directly identify the salary of administrative staff to it, right. So, it is an overhead. So, steps in overhead accounting: collection of overheads, allocation of overheads, apportionment of overheads, reapportionment of overheads and absorption of overheads. So, we will discuss this in this session. So, collection of overheads, right. What is collection of overheads? Overheads collection is the process of recording each item of cost in the records for the purpose of ascertainment of cost of each cost center or unit, right. So, all these overhead costs need to be collected, right. Why? Because for what is the basic objective, fundamental objective? The fundamental objective is the ascertainment of cost of each unit or cost center. Like for Maruti, if one unit is one wagon R car, right? So and it requires to estimate that what is the cost of one unit of wagon R passenger vehicle. So for that it needs to collect the information about the overheads. Collection, following are the source document for collection of overheads: stores requisition, wages sheet, cash book, purchase orders and invoices, etc. So from these documents, the overhead cost data can be collected. Now, allocation of overheads. Before the allocation and apportionment process starts, the first step is departmentalization of overhead expenses. So, overhead expenses are happening at different cost centers, so that need to be departmentalized. So, departmentalization means creating departments in the firm so that the overhead expenses can be conveniently allocated or apportioned to these departments, like machining, personnel, assembling, maintenance, tool rooms, stores, accounts, costing, etc. Allocation is the process by which cost items are charged directly to a cost unit or cost center. For example, electricity charges can be allocated to various departments if separate meters are installed, and salary of stores clerk can be allocated to stores department. Cost of coal used in boiler can be directly allocated to boiler house division. So, we need to identify that to which department the cost will be allocated. Like as I said that in production line, if there is a clerk, his salary can be allocated to the particular production, say assembly line or painting department, etc. Right? Apportionment of overheads. So, now wherever is, if I can directly allocate the overhead to the department or the unit, that is fine. Otherwise, I need to apportion. So, wherever possible, the overheads are to be allocated. However, if it is not possible to charge the overheads to a particular cost center or cost unit, they are to be apportioned to various departments on some suitable basis. So, what are the suitable basis? Say for electricity, it can be light point or machine hour. Rent, repair of building, it can be floor space. Insurance and depreciation of machinery, the value of machinery. The power, maybe the horsepower. Employee insurance expenses and canteen expenses, number of employees. So, these are the different examples, right, on the basis of which the overhead can be apportioned, right, because overhead you cannot directly allocate always to the direct product. So, you can use different other bases, reasonable bases for apportionment of it to the appropriate department. Okay. Reapportionment of overheads. The departments are broadly divided into production department and service department. Reapportionment of overhead means the overheads of the service departments are reapportioned to the production department. This process is called as preparation of secondary distribution summary of overheads. So, you got the overhead values. Now, you apportioned it over the production departments, also along with the service departments. So, when you do this, the service department is you are also allocating the overhead proportion. But suppose you want to know that what is the cost per unit, right, of the final produce, and that final produce is coming out from the production department, right. Service departments are basically for the supporting services like accounting, HR, finance, etc. Right. So, if I want to allocate all the overheads to only to the production departments, then what I can do is I can reapportion the overheads, right. So, this process called the secondary distribution summary. The methods of reapportionment are divided into two types. One is non-reciprocal method, second is reciprocal method. So, non-reciprocal method is, under this method, the assumption is that while service departments render services to the production departments, they do not render services to each other. And reciprocal method is, under this method, the assumption is that the service departments do render services to the production departments. They also render services to other service departments. So, absorption of overheads. Absorption means charging equitable share of overhead expenses to the products. The absorption is to made on some suitable basis. The basis is the absorption rate, which is calculated by dividing the overhead expenses by the base selected. Overhead absorption rate is equal to overhead expenses divided by units of base selected. So, this is the meaning of absorption, right? And for absorption you need to make some suitable basis, right? And you have to calculate the overhead absorption rate by dividing the total overhead expense by the units of the base selected, right? Now, we can classify the overheads under different categories, right? So, classification, the determination of the classes or groups in which the costs are subdivided, the actual process of classification of the various items of expenses into one or another of the groups. The classification of overheads expenditure depends on the type and size of business and the nature of product and service. Actually, this classification of overhead, this is a kind of science as well as an art. There are some subjectivity in it which is required, right? And we can do it under the two following bases. Number one is the functional analysis, and second one is depending upon the cost behavior, that is the behavioral analysis. So, for a recap, I am just doing a quick recapitulation. Overhead is what? Overhead is the sum of all the indirect expenses, indirect material plus indirect labor plus indirect expenses, right? And these overheads, as we cannot link it directly with the final product, so it needs to be allocated and apportioned. So, if it is directly allocated, this is fine, department wise or unit wise, but if it is not possible, then what we do? We do the apportionment, right? Okay. And if there are in general, in real world, a company, a factory or company consists of production departments as well as service departments, because the production departments need supporting services for their smooth functioning, right? So, when that happens, you need to reapportion the overhead which is allocated to the service department. So, that is required. Now, functional analysis, overheads can be divided into following categories on functional basis: manufacturing or production or factory overheads, administration overheads, selling and distribution overheads, research and development overheads. So, this is on the basis of function, we can divide the total overhead under these sections. Manufacturing or production or factory overhead. Manufacturing overheads include all indirect costs, that is indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses incurred for operation of manufacturing. This is important, operation of manufacturing or production, right, of a factory. There is another name for it. It is called. So, on the basis of function, we can first categorize the overhead as manufacturing or production or factory overhead. This includes all indirect costs like indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses, which is incurred for operation of manufacturing or production division. There is another name for it. It is called factory overhead or works overhead or factory cost or works cost, etc. Now, the second category which comes into play, it is the administration overhead. So, administration overhead is, it is the sum of all those costs of general management, secretarial, accounting and administrative services, which cannot be directly related to production, marketing, research or development functions of the enterprise. Administration overheads include the cost of formulating the policy, directing the organization and controlling the operations of an undertaking, which is not related directly to production, selling, distribution, research or development activity or function. Third functional overhead is selling and distribution overheads. Selling overheads is the cost of seeking to create and stimulate demand and of securing orders. It comprises the cost to products of distributors for soliciting and recurring orders for the articles or commodities dealt in, or of effort to find the retained customers. And this is selling overhead, right? This is for securing orders, and once you get the order, then you need to distribute it. So, distribution overhead is the expenditure incurred in the process which begins with making the packed product available for dispatch and ends with the making the reconditioned, returned empty package, if any, available for reuse. So, selling and distribution overhead, it includes expenditure incurred in transporting articles, right? Transporting articles to different storehouses, right? In moving articles for to and from prospective customer, as in the case of goods on sale or return basis. In case of gas, electricity and water industries, distribution means pipes, mains and services which may be regarded as equivalent to packing and transportation. And research and development overheads, this is the next one. Research overhead is incurred for the new product, new process of manufacturing any product. The development overhead is incurred for putting research result on commercial basis. So, these are the functional, these were the functional classification of overhead, right? The overhead incurred for manufacturing, for sales and distribution, for administration and for research and development. There is another way of looking at it, right, where we can classify the total overhead on the basis of their behavior, right. So, we can classify based on the behavioral patterns under majorly three categories. The first one is the fixed overhead, second one is the variable overhead and third one is semi-variable overhead. So, fixed overhead is the one which remain fixed in the total amount with increase and decrease in the volume of output or production activity. So, the overheads which does not change with the level of production, right, or level of activity, right, within a range, that is called the fixed overhead. So, for example, salary paid to the office staff, right, or rent paid for the building, right. So, rent paid to the, suppose the company is paying rent for factory shed. So, whether the factory works at 60% capacity or 80% capacity, the rent will remain the same, right. And it is an overhead. Why? Because you can't allocate it to the individual products. So, this type of overhead is called the fixed overhead. The fixed overhead costs remain the same for one period to another, except when they are deliberately changed, that is, increments granted to staff. The incidence of fixed overhead on unit cost decreases as production increases and vice versa. Okay. The fixed overheads are stated to be uncontrollable in the sense that they are not influenced by managerial decision, at least in the shorter run, right. If the company has already into some agreement to pay say 1 crore rupees rent as for the factory per month, right, then immediately it cannot change that. But in the longer run, of course, it can be changed, but in shorter run it is difficult to change. However, it should be noted that an expenditure is fixed within a specified limit relating to time and activity, right? What is fixed today, in the longer run, it may become variable. In a hypothetical organization, no expenditure remains unchanged for all time. Therefore, it is true to state that fixed overhead is fixed within specified limit relating to time and activity. After fixed overhead comes the variable overheads. Variable overhead costs are those costs which vary in total in direct proportion to the volume of output. For instance, if the output increases by 5%, the variable expenses also increase by 5%. Correspondingly, on a decline of the output, it will also decline proportionately. So, any overhead, if it proportionately increases and decreases, proportionately changes with the level of activity or level of production, then we call it a variable overhead, right? One example could be, that the wages to the casual workers who are not directly involved into production, right? So, if the activity increases, their wage bill also increases, otherwise it decreases sometimes. If I mix, the fixed overhead and the variable overhead in proportion, what comes out is the semi-variable. Semi-variable overheads are those which changes with the level of activity or level of production, but not proportionately, right? It is partly fixed and partly variable. They are known as semi-variable overheads because they contain both fixed and variable element. Semi-variable overheads do not fluctuate in direct proportion to volume. They are also called step costs. It may remain fixed within a certain activity level, but once that level is exceeded, they vary without having direct relationship with volume changes. Examples are depreciation, telephone charges, repair and maintenance of buildings, machines and equipments, etc. They have usually two parts. One is fixed, the other one is variable. For instance, depreciation usually depends on two factors, one time and other wear and tear. The two together make depreciation as a whole and the semi-variable. An analytical study thus can make it possible for all semi-variable expenses to split up in two parts. Fundamentally, therefore, there are only two types of expenses, fixed and variable. The following are the methods of segregating semi-variable overheads: comparison method, range method, equation method, graphical method, least square method, and the average method. First is the comparison method. So, under comparison method, what we do? The comparison method is followed to segregate the semi-variable overheads into fixed overheads and variable overheads. Under this method, the quantity of output at two different levels is compared with the corresponding amount of expense. The amount of fixed overhead remains same and the amount of variable overhead is calculated as follows. So, the variable cost per unit is change in amount of expenses divided by change in quantity or output. Range method. This method is also known as high and low points method. Under this method, the amount of expense at the highest and lowest levels are compared and related to output attained at those levels. As the amount of fixed overheads remain the same, the change in indirect cost is due to the variable portion. So, variable cost per unit is equal to change in amount of expense divided by change in output. We can also solve it using the equation method. Under this method, variable and fixed portions of overhead are ascertained by means of straight line equation. The straight line equation is y is equal to mx plus c, where y is equal to total semi-variable cost, c is the fixed cost included in the semi-variable cost, and m is the variable cost per unit, and x is the output or number of units. Average method is another method. Under this method of segregation of fixed and variable elements is made by first taking the average of two selected groups and then applying the range method equation method as the case may be, right. Graphic method, under the graphical method, volume of output is drawn on horizontal axis and semi-variable expenses on vertical axis. Expenses corresponding to each volume are plotted on the graph paper, and a straight line, the line of best fit, is drawn through the points plotted. And this straight line represents the total cost line. The point where the straight line intersects the vertical axis is taken to be the amount of fixed expenses. A parallel line from the intersecting point to the amount of fixed expenses. A parallel line from the intersection point to the horizontal axis gives a fixed cost line. There is another method which is called the least square method. Under this method, the segregation of fixed and variable elements of semi-variable overhead is made by finding out the line of best fit for a number of observations with the help of statistical methods, where y is equal to total semi-variable cost, c is equal to fixed cost included in semi-variable cost, m is equal to variable cost per unit, and x is equal to output or number of units.